Greetings, you Herle Burlyites. It's been a while since I mentioned how much I appreciate you navigating the space-time wormhole that is Apple ratings and reviews. It's super important for us here at Air Quotes Media to hear your feedback and adjust the show accordingly, or just get some sense we're on the right track. So I really appreciate comments like this one from Golf Swing Has Returned. Entertaining/informative equals the Herle Burly podcast. This podcast touches on really important issues on how we govern ourselves. David is a master interviewer who can put his guests at ease and coax their unvarnished opinion on the subject at hand. It's like being back in university with a guest lecturer who is a practitioner, but with a lighter tone and more swearing. I walk the dog while listening, which sometimes freaks him out when he sees me laughing. Well, I'm blushing, and I thank you for that. Golf Swing Has Returned. Please know that I freak out my dog Ryder, and come to think of it, my partner Terry, just by walking into a room. All right, that brings us to today's pod. Our guest is Michael Balagus. Michael is a longtime strategist and mover and shaker for the NDP federally and provincially. One of the things I love about this podcast is being able to introduce people to the masters of Canadian politics, and Michael is certainly one of them. Until very recently, the Chief of Staff and Principal Secretary for Andrea Horwath in the Ontario NDP Caucus, and he served as Chief of Staff for Premiers Gary Doerr and Greg Selinger in Manitoba. He's been the CEO of the Ontario Nurses Association, 6 years of international political experience with the National Democratic Institute, mostly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, while living in Sarajevo for 4 years. And he also helped Jagmeet Singh set up his office in 2018 and get on his feet. Today, we're going to talk about all things Canadian politics, what's going on in the federal scene, what to make of the Poilievre strategy, how Liberals and New Democrats should respond to that, and what happened in the Ontario election. So, Michael, great to have you here. Thank you for making the time to have this conversation with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting, interesting. I always enjoy talking with you, and this will be good.
Yeah, well, normally we've talked after you've handed my ass to me, so I can understand why you enjoy it so much. Hey, but like me, you got a prairie background. Where are you from?
I was actually born in Toronto, but left at the tender age of 11 months, and grew up in Winnipeg, North End Winnipeg, where all good Winnipeggers grow up. Yeah. And I spent most of my time there. As I said, I did live for a while in Ottawa and spent 4 very interesting years living in Sarajevo, which was really a bit of a life-changing experience. But in Toronto now, and soon headed back to Manitoba.
Right. How long did you live in Manitoba?
60 years, 50 years, 55 years, I would say, off and on.
Right. And you're headed back there.
Yeah, we're headed out at the end of the month. Originally came, as you mentioned earlier, with the Ontario Nurses Association, originally came to Toronto, recruited to work as the CEO, which was very exciting. I lasted 2 years, and then the political bug bit again. And a wonderful woman named Andrea Horwath took me out for dinner one day and asked if I would join her staff coming out of what was for the Ontario NDP and Andrea, a very difficult 2014 election. And I did. And I think we managed to do some very, very good things over the last 8 years.
So how'd you get interested in politics?
I grew up, you're going to like this. I grew up in a political family. My father was a campaign manager for the Conservatives in Manitoba, and my mother was the riding association president of a North Winnipeg riding. And my very first campaign happened to be the campaign that elected Ed Schreier as Premier of Manitoba in 1969. I was the tender age of 13 and doing literature drops for the losing Conservative candidate in that election. So that kind of got me started. And
I did my first lit drop when I was 13 too, just coincidentally, by the way. 1975 provincial election in Saskatchewan. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was that. That was my start. And I guess as I like to think, as I got older and wiser and hitting the age of 20, kind of discovered that the Conservatives weren't really the party that kind of captured where my head was at, and got active first in the media, quite frankly. I was a reporter with CTV in Winnipeg for a couple of years. I was. And then came out of that experience is when I really started to gravitate towards the New Democrats and got a job offer as the Director of Communications for the Minister of Labour in 1984. And it was the rest is history, as they say.
Interesting. You had a chance to work with Gary Doerr, right?
I did. And he was, it was a great learning experience. I have to tell you,
I've never met him, but I know a lot of people who tell me that he's a wonderfully nice man, but also one of the most talented politicians they ever saw.
Yeah, he is. He is both of those things. And for me, it was just a tremendous learning experience. First time I worked with him was in the 1988 campaign, when his first campaign, which
was that the crazy Sharon Carstairs campaign?
That was it. This was the campaign where we were a majority government with a one-seat majority. One of our backbenchers decided, with 2 years left in our term, to vote against the budget, brought down the government. Howard Poilievre resigned 2 days later. So we are in an election campaign and in a leadership campaign simultaneously. Gary came out of that as the leader, and it's pretty safe to say when we went into that campaign, we were almost in single digits, and we were looking at maybe hanging on to 2 seats, and we ended up hanging on to 12. And that was my first experience working directly with Gary, and was quite exciting. And then got reunited with him in 2003 when he was premier, and I came back from Bosnia to Manitoba and got to work with him again. And there are a few people who have as strong political instincts as he does. Like, he can read people, whether it's the room or the province. He reads them and he communicates with them at a really remarkable level. So it was a great learning experience. And when he left and I stayed to work for Greg Selinger, I remember I was described it to my friends as, now I'm flying without a net, because Gary was always a net. If I was making a bad decision, he was there to bail me out. And I was quite worried that he was gone and I was on my own, but it worked out.
Is he an interesting example of the difference between prairie or Western New Democrats who have been in government for a long time and the National New Democratic Party, in the sense that he was generally described as a pragmatist, and I've heard people tell me that ideologically he would have fit quite comfortably in the Federal Liberal Party in the 90s and 2000s. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's no question he was a pragmatist. And the thing I liked about Gary and my own personal experience is, if you are a politician and you have no desire to govern, then you shouldn't be a politician. Because your job as a politician is to get elected and improve the lives of people. That's right. Should be why you're in it. And, I think people don't realize that Gary was much, much more progressive than a lot of folks gave him credit for. And he would often say, like, we would do some stuff, particularly around welfare rates, for example, First Nations education, etc., that were really, really ahead of their time. But his thing was, let's just do it. We don't have to get into our pulpit. We don't have to preach to people. Let's just do it and get it done. And that's what we would do. And a lot of the sort of public communications was more targeted at the sort of key electoral folks we needed to get reelected to continue to do those kinds of things. And that was very much his approach. We can do really progressive things. I don't need to, and he didn't need to be, to be praised as this great progressive person. He just needed to get things done and make people's lives better. And it was a really good learning experience.
Interesting. Did he ever have federal aspirations? Was it the language issue, or what stopped him from maybe going federal?
I don't think he did. Beyond the taking on the role as a U.S. ambassador, he was a Manitoba boy. I remember doing some focus groups one time in the run-up to the election, and I could not think of a better better call.
Wait a second, am I right? Was he appointed by Mulroney?
No, he was appointed by Harper.
Oh, Harper, right. Sorry. Yeah.
But we were doing some focus groups one time, and there were people were talking about Gary, and they said, well, you see him everywhere. So, you know what? Manitoba is his office. And that's the way people felt about him. You know,
right.
we used to joke that, you know, every guy wanted to have a beer with him and every woman wanted to go out for dinner with him. It was not a bad place to be.
Well, what a Hobson's choice for him, eh? All right. Hey, Michael, let's talk some federal politics here. Now that Poilievre's in place as the Conservative leader, what's your overall assessment of the federal political landscape?
You know, I think it's going to be very, very interesting what he does versus what he has done to get where he is. And if he's at all watching the Doug Ford experience in Ontario, where, you know, Doug came in as the great disruptor and he was, you know, just did some really, really ridiculous things and then realized eventually he's not going to get reelected doing that. And I think this will be the real measurement of where he goes. I don't think his election is a positive thing for federal politics, but you know it really is kind of a response to where things are at right now. There's a frustration, there's an anger out there. I think people have to recognize that, and I think, you know, dealing with it as, you know, A, you don't want to deny it, and B, you don't want to belittle those people. Like, there's a lot of people who are legitimately angry. Like, the pandemic took an incredible toll on people, and not everybody felt listened to or respected during it.
Why don't you think his election is a positive thing?
I don't think it's positive because I think his election, the further we move into extremes, the worse it is for politics. And I think that the sort of dog whistle style, the exclusively voting against as opposed to voting for, it's not a positive contribution. It's certainly not from a policy perspective. I don't think he's put anything on the table that's remotely interesting or remotely innovative or that would remotely help people that he proposes that he needs to help.
Right. What do you think politically of his strategy?
I think his strategy was smart. I mean, it's like what the Conservatives have become very, very good at, we saw it in the Ontario provincial election, and we may talk about it again, is recognizing the voters they need and really motivating those folks to get out and vote. Right. And not worrying about growing, not worrying about attracting other people, not worrying about offending other people. Just what does it take? These are the folks that are going to get us elected. And in his case, these are the folks that are going to make me leader. They're the folks I'm talking to. And I don't care about the rest of you right now. I'll figure that out later. And that figure that out later, though, becomes very important. If you do want to be prime minister of this country, you do have to figure that out eventually.
Well, in Ontario, in Ontario, they did switch votes, though, didn't they? I mean, there are ridings where people used to vote Liberal and now vote Conservative. There are ridings where people used to vote NDP and now vote Conservative in Ontario. So, I mean, I agree with you in terms of the general strategic approach is to motivate turnout, but there is some vote shifting going on out there as well, too, isn't there?
No, and there absolutely is. And I think they've been able to tap into particularly that traditional blue-collar, working-class New Democrat who is concerned about jobs and the economy. Those are folks that they've done a very, very good job. Now, I would argue that it's as much as we've done a bad job as they've done a good job in terms of talking to and appealing to that particular group of voters. And particularly at this time, when they are worried, they came out of a pandemic right into this massive inflationary period, and are, quite frankly, many of them are worried that we may be heading into a recession. And so these folks are increasingly concerned about cost of living, jobs, economic issues. And the Conservatives, particularly in Ontario, did a good job talking to them about it constantly. The Liberals didn't, and the NDP certainly didn't. And so I think you saw some shifting there. I don't think that that's permanent. I think we have the ability to bring those people back. But that's going to be a challenge. And it's not just unique to Ontario. I think you're seeing that on the left right across North America and certainly in parts of Europe, where that traditional union, blue-collar, working-class vote, the Conservatives have done a very, very good job of filling the void that's been opened up by our parties, quite frankly, not speaking to those people on the issues that matter to them.
So, Michael, this takes me to an uncomfortable question, or at least it's uncomfortable for me because I'm an old white guy, and I feel very uncomfortable on this terrain. But how much of that schism between the progressive parties, let's just say the NDP, for example, and working class men, is cultural, not economic? The Conservatives are now talking a lot about the woke agenda. And just to be blunt, how much of this is a blue-collar worker looking at Jagmeet Singh talking about Indigenous reconciliation and just concluding he's not for him?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the first thing that I think is important in this discussion, and I agree with you, this can be very awkward, uncomfortable turf for folks like us. But in Ontario in particular, blue-collar workers are not necessarily the old white guy with the lunch bucket anymore. They are racialized. They're culturally diverse. And what I noticed when we did research with these folks, what they liked about Doug Ford was he talked to them as workers, and they felt respected by him and they felt acknowledged by him. And I think that sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that the only issues of relevance are the sort of race and cultural issues. They are tremendously important. I don't think anybody can deny that, and need to be addressed. But at the same time, continuing to recognize that these same folks go to work every day, buy groceries every day, raise a family every day, and for many of them, those are top of mind issues. So I don't think there's a huge contrast when you're talking about, because those are the blue collar workers of today. They're very, very much the blue collar workers of today.
Okay, cool. Let's get back to let's get back to federal politics and Poilievre. So, given what he's got going, what's the way to respond to him, both personally and policy-wise? Like, let's start with personally. How do you deal with a guy like Poilievre, who, is a unique performer in Canadian politics, and with his, I've not seen that aggressive a style in a leadership position before.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer. I mean, he is a great performer. He brings tremendous amount of energy, and again, he plays to a specific audience, and the rest of the audience, if you don't like his act, go home. He plays to a very, very specific audience, which then makes it extremely challenging. I think the key is that to try as much as possible to stay on the issues and to stay on the things that are going to motivate and bring people around in terms of what you have to offer. Now, he's up against, Justin Trudeau is no shrinking violet when it comes to personality. Jagmeet Singh. I mean, this is actually kind of a unique time in federal politics right now.
You want to sing some Bohemian Rhapsody right now just to freak out the Conservatives?
Yeah, I mean, there are three. I would say there is no lack of charisma in federal leadership in Ottawa today. And but that charisma has a different appeal to different audiences. And how that plays out will be interesting. I just think the key is not to get sucked into his game on his turf. I think that's really the key stuff. And personality matters. I mean, it absolutely matters. I mean, the Ontario Conservatives people who voted Conservative love Doug Ford. They have difficult naming two good things he's done since he's premier, but they like him and they vote for him.
For the past few weeks, we've been traveling through South Korea, Australia, Sweden, the UK, Germany, France, and the US. A world tour on our presenting sponsor TELUS's ticket. International best practices of countries who are using evidence to make effective policy around how they allocate their spectrum. So what have we learned through it all, Herle Burlyites? Well, if Canada wants to gain as much economic, social, and environmental benefit as possible from digital technologies, we need to heed the examples of countries around the world, and in TELUS's view, adopt this simple objective for Canadian spectrum policy. Put as much spectrum to use for the benefit of all Canadians as quickly as possible. They believe to achieve this, the way we allocate and manage that spectrum needs to be modernized to better fit the needs of our country. Our ability to compete in the innovation economy and our environmental priorities are all tied to digital solutions. Having optimal policy around spectrum is critical to achieving these goals. And that all comes down to evidence and data, Herle Burlyites, two words with which I'm intimately familiar: evidence that takes into account best practices from around the world, and data that clearly shows how a policy is impacting a stated objective. Remember those two words. We're going to talk about them more next week. Poilievre, last thing about Poilievre, because we have a vigorous debate on The Curse of Politics, my other podcast, about this from time to time. Is he unorthodox or dangerous?
I think he has the potential to be dangerous. I would say right now he's unorthodox, but I think he has the potential to be dangerous because there is, and we saw it in the winter in Ottawa during the occupation up there. There is an audience in Canada that can be motivated and can be convinced to do some things that are not particularly healthy in a democratic society. We certainly saw it go right over the top in the U.S. And the question is he prepared to motivate those folks to that extent? They're there. Can't deny they're there. That they're not there, they are.
Well, surely a part of what he's doing is trying to reach voters who normally wouldn't vote in elections. And they wouldn't vote in an election because they would think that all the parties are the same and none of them represent them and none of them will change anything that they care about. And so now they potentially will see somebody who is trying to represent them and does talk about what they care about. Is that not a good thing?
It's certainly a good thing from an electoral strategy. It has the a lot of it, though. You gotta
Well, should we have been trying to talk to those people? Should the NDP or the Liberals have been
Absolutely.
trying to or was it reasonable to just say we're just going to leave a bunch of people who think the politics is fucked and doesn't represent them, and we won't talk to them? We'll just put them off in a corner.
No, we absolutely should. But the other point is that quite often the anger, frustration, and motivation of those people is not necessarily based on fact or truth. I mean, this is a whole other dynamic that's now come into this, the conspiracy theories, the undermining, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a whole different ballgame. And exploiting that is dangerous. Talking to folks and acknowledging, yeah, you have a right to be frustrated. Yeah, you haven't been well represented. All that's fine as long as it's based on fact. And in this case, it's not always based on fact. And in fact, much of what motivated what happened in Ottawa over the winter was not factually based. I mean, it was conspiracies, it was rumors, it was innuendo that people were able to use and drive and motivate. I think, the one thing, I think the Conservative Party of Canada is a very different beast than the Republican Party of the US. And I think that there may be a stabilizing factor in there that may hold him a little bit more accountable. We'll see.
You see the irony in the fact that if people, you said the issue is that people are economically distressed and looking for change in that regard. And to the extent that that's true, these people were fucked by globalization and the neoliberal agenda of the 1990s and 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And so in frustration, they turn to conservatives. What does that say?
Well, I think the reason they turn to conservatives lately is less the sort of historical of how things evolved and more of in the moment. And when it's easier, when the left appears to be much more concerned with things like preserving endangered species than they are about a mine and a town closing down and everybody losing their job, that creates a huge void. Should people be concerned about endangered species? Absolutely. But if that's all you hear people talking about and you're sitting there worried about where your next paycheck's coming from, you're going to get very frustrated. And I think that is more of what's happened than the sort of historical piece.
Right. Interesting. So Trudeau says he's going to run again, and I know he has to say that, but let's assume he does run again. What do you think? Can he beat Poilievre?
I think if he runs again, I think it's a bit of a game changer in Ontario. Outside of the Toronto area, one of the things that we noticed in the provincial election, and quite frankly, I was a bit blindsided by it, was the level of frustration and anger with not so much the Liberals, but with Trudeau personally. A lot of it's become personal. And in our phone banks, for example, the most negative feedback we were getting from northern, rural, southwestern Ontario was the federal-provincial deal between Jagmeet and Trudeau. And New Democrats in those areas were pissed off about that. So you can imagine what the rest would be. So I think that Trudeau running again is going to provide a big opening for the Conservatives in Ontario.
Interesting. What is it about Trudeau that New Democrats don't like?
Well, again, it's a particular group of New Democrats. Many of us don't like him for a whole variety of reasons. But I think for these folks, they feel that I think they feel he doesn't get them. I think they feel that he speaks down to them, and I think he feels that he doesn't represent them. I think is the main sort of frustrations that they feel there, and that came out loud and clear for us during the provincial election as one of the most negatives that we were dealing with.
Yeah, you do kind of constantly get the impression that he wishes you were a better person.
Yeah, he does. And I try my best.
Great. How are Singh and the NDP going to avoid the fate that faces almost all junior partners and coalitions, which is that the government gets the credit, the blame, whatever is used from the work of the coalition. The other party has no visibility and no record and has been neutered in its capacity to run against the other party and therefore gets smashed in the subsequent election. There's a lot of history about that.
There is, and I think that's a real danger of what we're seeing in Ottawa now. I think that Jagmeet and his team are doing the best they can in terms of beating the drum and staying front and center and trying to get some of that credit. That that these good things, whether it's the dental or some of the pandemic relief and support that came out during the pandemic. I mean, they made it very, very clear that the Liberals would not have done this had they not been pushed. And I think that's all they can do is to continue to sort of beat that drum as loudly and clearly as possible. And I think I think it's believable at this point. And I think, again, to your point about Trudeau running again, I think that's part of an opportunity for Jagmeet, is that you've seen this guy, and if we're not there to push him, he talks a lot, but he doesn't deliver. And I think that's what they're going to have to continue to drive. How successful that will be, because they're not the first minor partner to try that strategy. We'll see. But
Yeah, it's hard to believe that at the end of the day, most Canadians are going to think the NDP got them the GST credit or anything like that, right?
No, they're not.
Despite a big, I know that there's a big social media effort going on and all that kind of stuff, but it's just not the way people hear it and interpret it or understand our system.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sort of the big showpiece, the dental thing that they're doing, doesn't affect enough people directly in their day-to-day life. And that's another thing. It's a very good value statement, and it is going to be an incredibly important program for some Canadians. But it's not going to be sort of top of mind. Thank God that Jagmeet Singh got me. Well, he didn't. He got it for these folks over here.
He got somebody some money for dental care, but probably not me.
Yeah.
Right. Every day now, some very long trains are making their way out of the prairies, headed to seaports in British Columbia and Eastern Canada. They're loaded with Canada's famously excellent grain, and that grain is shipped in something called hopper cars, sometimes 200 at a time. Our sponsor, CN, has been building a fleet of new hopper cars. It will have 6,000 of them, new generation and high capacity, by the time they're all deployed. Why, you ask, are they called hopper cars? Well, faithful listeners, I have the answer. The word hopper originated in Old England, sometime in the 14th century. A hopper was basically a funnel into which millers poured grains to be ground into flour. As you might guess, hoppers hopped, and as they shook, they separated, the wheat from the chaff. One of the first references to hoppers was in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Anyway, here we are 700 years later, and Canada's grain crop is being moved from Western Canada to market in these rather ingeniously engineered cars. They don't hop, but they sure roll, and they make loading and unloading the grain as smooth and quick as possible. The new fleet of hopper cars is just one piece in a series of purchases and equipment upgrades CN has undertaken in recent years to ensure it can continue to deliver cargo safely and on time. And there is no more vital cargo than grain. By the time this year's crop is all shipped, CN reckons it'll have moved 28 million tons. It's hardly news anymore that supply chains worldwide are clogged and unreliable. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine, another major global supplier of grain, has triggered worldwide distortions of supply and demand. So it's kind of something for CN to be able to report that it is current on grain orders as the season moves into its heaviest months, meaning shipments are leaving and arriving on schedule, which was the plan all along. What would Singh or the NDP have to be saying to get the same kind of people turning out to their rallies as Poilievre got for his? Like, why can't the left rally people right now?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. I think it's at the end of the day, it's connecting with them on an emotional level of where they're at. And I'm not sure we do that well. I think that we certainly don't do it as well as the Conservatives. The Conservatives, very emotional, very responsive in terms of where people are at. And again, when you come, they have one audience, one message, and they hammer it loud, they hammer it clear. But the most important thing is it's where people are at. And they've got a good notion of what does it take to get that guy off the couch or that woman off the couch and to come to the rally or vote. And I'm not sure we do. I think we have all kinds of things. What would it take to have an interesting conversation about this issue or an interesting discussion about where this might go? And yeah, that's great for some folks, but it's not going to fill a room at a rally.
The Poilievre has no shortage of villains in his narrative. There's a lot of people that are screwing the people at his rallies, and he's going to go out and slay those people for them. The NDP villain, generally, when I read Singh's social media, etc., it's CEOs. And is Singh's villain, and that makes sense from a populist left perspective. But I don't get the sense that people are as angry at CEOs as he wants them to be. Why isn't that? Why is that the case?
I think part of it is because CEOs provide jobs, and people see that there's a sort of economic thing. I think where the greater frustration is among, if I could describe them as elites, and I don't say that in the negative sense, but more in the sort of cultural sense, where the bigger frustration is than with CEOs, I think, is with liberal politicians, small L liberal politicians, with academia, with a lot of folks in the sort of activist community. I think that's where a lot of these folks' frustrations are, even more so than with the CEOs. I think, you'll know when you talk about, we're going to increase taxes on the big wealthy corporations and people have two responses. You'll never do it. And so why won't we do it? Because they won't pay it. They'll hire better accountants, or worse yet, they'll leave town. And I think what people saw a number of years ago, when those plants actually got loaded onto trucks and driven across the U.S. border, that changed a lot in terms of people's sense that you can somehow bring these people to heel, and it's much more difficult.
I saw research in the States that led me to believe that Americans, and there's a different culture there, obviously, but that Americans don't hate or envy rich people because they admire them. What they hate are the managerial and professional class, people like me, the barnacles on the rich, who hang around the rich waiting for the droppings, and actually are the gatekeepers Poilievre is talking about, right?
I don't think it's that different in Canada. I mean, people quite often, you say, well, why the rich people have to pay more? Well, why should they? They earned it.
Right.
So one of the sort of great things about when we talked about Doug Ford and the fact that Doug Ford is comes from a very, very wealthy family. Well, he earned it. Well, he actually didn't earn it. He inherited it. Right. And as Gary Doerr used to describe it as the lucky sperm club. And if you were born to it, great. But people, there is a sense that people who have money have, they've kind of earned it, and leave them alone. Right.
You and I come from Saskatchewan. You come from Manitoba. And unlike me, you remain close to Manitoba. I cannot in any way pretend that I'm an analyst of Saskatchewan politics anymore. But what has happened to rural Manitoba and Saskatchewan that it has become so monolithically conservative?
Yeah, I mean,
in our lifetimes, this is a huge change.
Oh no, it absolutely is. I mean, if you look at the CCF historically and the NDP on the prairies, the co-op movement was really a huge underpinning of what drove the CCF and the NDP success on the prairies. And I think over time, as certainly in Manitoba, I can speak a little better about Manitoba, as the population shifted more and more to the city. And in Manitoba, there is only one city, with all due respect to Brandon, there is only one city. And as more and more the population shifted there, more and more the political attention shifted as well, because that's where your electoral success is. And I think increasingly people in rural Manitoba were not feeling well represented by the NDP. Or the Conservatives for a while, but the Conservatives did manage to, and still manage to hang on to more of that support, certainly than we have in Saskatchewan. I truly do not understand. It is a seismic shift in Saskatchewan.
Well, it's like rural Saskatchewan's like a 70-80% Conservative proposition now. It's outrageous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know. When you think about it, I mean, it's over a course of 30 years or so, but that's not a long time. And it is very entrenched. It is very, very entrenched. And I don't know what brings it back.
Well, it's something that we both need to be thinking about. That's for sure. Can we talk about Ontario for a minute?
Sure.
Unpleasant as it is, I had to talk about Ontario after 2018, so I'll make you talk about Ontario. What happened?
I'm fleeing the province. So
yeah, I know.
Yeah, no.
Hey, after Paul Martin lost the 2006 election, the very first call I got was from a fellow that I bet's a mutual friend of ours, Bill Knight.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I didn't know Bill very well, but he was the first person to call me, and he said, okay, now you're in a lot of trouble, right? He said, you're in a lot of trouble, and not from the people you think are your enemies, but from the people you think are your friends, right? The party's going to turn and eat you alive. He said, when I ran Blakeney's campaign in Saskatchewan in 1982, and election night, I took the midnight train to Winnipeg just to get the hell out of town.
Yeah, no, it is something we all accept in these roles, that you can go from hero to goat instantly, and I've been both, and it's as I think we all have. But yeah, I mean, I think I think for the NDP, and I'll talk about that first, and I'd be really interested to hear where you think the Liberals are headed. But, for the NDP, I think 8 consecutive years as official opposition is unprecedented. I think that they are the party, I say they, we, are in a stronger position than we've ever been before. I mean, we've had the 8 years. We've had the experience. Yes, we went backwards by about 10 seats last time around, but if you look at the last election, I mean, that was a very, very challenging election. I mean, I don't have to tell you that. It was extremely challenging. And in hindsight and looking in the rearview mirror, it may never have been an opportunity for either the NDP or the Liberals in the last election to prevent that second majority. But having said that, I think the future there's a tremendous potential for the New Democrats. I'm not going to do the Ed Broadbent mistake of announcing the death of the Liberal Party of Ontario, and now we're going to head to a 2-party system in Ontario of the Conservatives and the New Dems. Because the
forgotten turning point in the 88 election.
Yeah, it sure was.
A forgotten turning point in the 88 election.
Yep, it certainly was. And I mean, the Liberal Party of Canada is just too strong. Liberal Party of Ontario is the brand of that party. The strength of that party means you can never write it off. And 88, that was so as much as I wish, because boy, I'll tell you, managing a campaign in a 2-party system like we had in Manitoba is a hell of a lot easier than trying to do this 3-party stunt that you have to try to pull off in Ontario or federally.
If I was going to challenge your assessment of, progress for the NDP, I would suggest that 2 elections in a row, the NDP have had an historically weak Liberal offering in the election campaign, with the Liberals getting around the level of support in 2018 that the NDP normally gets. So the roles were reversed. Mm-hmm. So the question would be, given that 2 shots at a run at it, why couldn't they win?
Yeah, I think they're 2 very different campaigns and 2 very different shots. I think the 2018 campaign, I can assure you, I have spent many a sleepless night trying to figure out why we didn't get that across the finish line.
I thought you were going to win.
Yeah, and well, so did I. So it's and then about E-7, E-8, you just started to see this drip, and so now, having said that, we were very successful in 2018 in terms of capturing a pretty substantial chunk of the Liberal vote.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question about that. What we were unable to do was to peel off that last 5-6%, or hang on to, I should say. We did have that 5 or 6% of the Conservative vote we needed to go over the top. That's the piece that we really lost in the last part of the campaign. In 2018 or in 2022, I agree with you at the leadership level, and I say this with the greatest respect of Mr. Del Duca. I think at the leadership level, we had a much weaker leader than Kathleen Wynne. Despite Wynne's record, she still had some appeal on that left, on those NDP Liberal cross-pressured voters. There still was some appeal there. Del Duca, in our experience, really had none of it. And we, to your point, a good part of our campaign was predicated on once the campaign starts and people get to see this guy, that Liberal vote is really going to start to collapse and come our way. It's certainly what all of our research told us was the potential, and that would then give us the momentum we needed. And again, and it didn't happen. And I think it didn't happen for two reasons. The first one was I have never been involved in a campaign that had less interest among the public.
Why were people so disinterested? It was crazy.
I think it was the pandemic hangover. I think people were still.
I can't recall if anybody raised the election with me spontaneously at any point, Michael.
It was unbelievable. I had never seen such a disinterested electorate. It changed a little bit coming out of the May long weekend, a little bit, but not much. And so consequently, people weren't looking. So that was one of the problems I think that we had, is people simply were not paying attention. And then the other one, and again, I go back to my earlier point about the strength of the Liberal Party in Ontario. There's a lot of those folks who in 2018 wanted, for whatever reason, and you probably know better than I, wanted to kick the Liberals in the ass and kick them hard. And they did. And they washed their hands of it, and now I'm going home. And those people went home, and they were quite content to be there. So this is going to be the big challenge for New Democrats going forward. And I don't think we can win an election in Ontario strictly on the basis of battling the Liberals, period, for that cross-pressured Liberal NDP vote. I think we've got to open up, and we've got to find a way. And for us, it's the 905. It's it's the Mississaugas of the world. It's the Bramptons of the world. It's the Durhams of the world. There's a vote there for us, and it's voting Conservative right now, not Liberal. And that's an area that we've got to make some inroads in. And as long as the election is we'll split with a remarkably low turnout that we had last time. We'll split a 50-50 with the Liberals. I don't know if people realize, 17% of eligible voters in Ontario elected Doug Ford's majority government. 17% of eligible voters in Ontario. That is a crime. And I'm not saying that it's not a legitimate victory. There's mayors who get elected on less than that. Yeah. But it is something that folks like us need to get our head around. Because that's part of the polarization. As the pool of voters shrinks and shrinks, then you get into this sole issue of how do I motivate my folks? And there's two things that motivate people, and one the Conservatives are really good at, and that's anger, that's frustration. That's what we saw in 2018. I want to kick that party out, that leader out. That's motivational. The other is that. Is a bit of this is going to sound extremely cynical, but also what's motivational is what's in it for me.
Come on, that's not cynical. That's reality. I've been doing public opinion research for 30 years, and there's no surer guide to somebody's opinion than understanding their self-interest.
Exactly. Now, as a New Democrat, I'm not supposed to say that, but hopefully,
or at least understanding their perception of their self-interest. Which may be different, at least in your opinion. But
extremely different.
So one of the reasons, in my view, that the NDP couldn't coalesce the Liberals behind them in this 2022 election was because there wasn't enough anger against Ford. Why were Ontarians so forgiving of Ford's dismal record?
Well, I think the starting point is the majority of Ontarians weren't forgiving. They were angry, and some, more than half the people who didn't vote for him, and a lot of the people that stayed home were very angry with them, or not very. They weren't very angry. I think that's key, but they certainly didn't think he did a good job. And part of it is certainly what we saw in the run up to the election and all the research that we did, and it became very, very clear 10 days into the campaign, it was, if coming out of that pandemic and that circus that was the Ontario government, you're still voting for Doug Ford, there is nothing that's going to change your mind.
I thought he could have been beaten on long-term care alone. What a scandal that was.
Yeah. Oh, it was a horrible scandal. It was one of the worst scandals. And I guess one of the biggest disappointments too is it was a real opportunity to fix it. And if I look at what my single biggest disappointment coming out of the 2022 election is that we didn't win and we didn't get to fix it. Because a chance like that may never come again. Not in my lifetime. And it's very, very unfortunate. But the people who liked Doug Ford, and even those who didn't like him but couldn't get mad at him, that little folksy routine of his paid dividends at the end. Everything was, doing focus group work with cross-pressured Liberal NDP voters. I'm voting for Doug Ford. Oh, yeah, he's done a lot of good things. Oh, yeah, what's he done? Blank. Nothing. Could not name a single thing. Occasionally someone said, well, I got a vaccine. Okay, well, that's good. But, but he listens to me. He respects me. That's two things that they felt about him. And I'm talking mainly about, and we talked about them earlier in the show, really talking about those sort of blue-collar, traditional, middle to low-income folks who really believe that he got them. And that he was one of them. And I think that really took the edge off some of the anger that people had. They didn't see him as arrogant. They saw him
and despite being wealthy, he's definitely not elite. He's one of the few leaders that working class people probably feel that when he's looking at them, he's not thinking, "It's really too bad you didn't go to university."
Yeah, or I need to, we had a member of our caucus whose name shall not be mentioned, who would start every discussion with, "You need to know." Yeah. That's how they would start it off. And it's like
he's gone on to write speeches for Chrystia Freeland, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's hear your take. Why did the Liberal campaign stall? Looked like they had a little momentum early, and then it just drifted into the netherworld.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was Stephen Del Duca's inability to really connect with folks. I know they tried it. They tried to soften him up. They did the dad jokes in the car. They did everything that they could, and some of the criticism, quite frankly, of him was unfair. Some of it was very superficial in terms of his appearance and how he comes across, etc. But also, these
things are reality of politics, though, right? I mean, you have to factor these things in.
Well, it absolutely is. I mean, you'll remember that horrible ad that they ran Jean Chrétien in the federal election, and the Conservatives had to take it off the air. And I was working in Ottawa at the time for Audrey McLaughlin, and we knew the number one downfall that Chrétien had was his physical appearance. People just said, that guy can't represent Canada. Look at him. And we would not go near it with a 10-foot pole, but the Conservatives, out of desperation, gave it a shot, and it really blew up in their face. So, yeah, physical does matter.
Wait, can I just stop there? Because there's an interesting follow-up. I want to just move a different place on because you raised that. And it related back to 2022, which is Alan Gregg will maintain to this day that ad would have worked if they'd left it on the air. And they took it off because of backlash through earned media that framed it as an entirely inappropriate gesture, to the point where Campbell said, "I won't stand behind it," and pulled it, right?
Yep.
In 2022, in Ontario, there's no such earned media function, right?
Nope.
None. That wouldn't have happened.
That's true. It's absolutely true. And it's kind of, part of me goes, yay. It's like, we can now advertise freely and we don't have to worry about it. But the other side is that, there's no arbiter out there anymore. of what people are saying or what people are doing. You know, in the good old days or bad old days, depending on how you want to look at it, if you put a negative ad up, you research that thing inside out. And because if you made one
had
mistake
to be bulletproof.
in that,
Soldiers in the streets, baby.
absolutely. Because if you made one mistake in that, they were going to shove that up your butt so fast. Yep. And so it doesn't matter anymore. Like, it doesn't matter anymore. You can say anything. And 2018 was the best example. I mean, all of the conservative advertising targeting us, none of it was based on any facts. No. None of it was based on a single fact. And but there's nobody arbitrates that anymore. Nobody, you get this, and when they do, and with all due respect to our friends at the Star, we're going to say, here's how many lies this guy told. Here's how many lies this guy told. And it's not a particularly helpful or a particularly useful way to do things.
Well, the Star threw you under the bus. The Star basically endorsed Ford for all intents and purposes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which is, John Hondrick rolling in his grave, watching that happen, I'm sure. So the Liberal problems was all Del Duca?
I think it was a big chunk of it. I don't know internally. But the other thing to remember, is it takes time to bring a party together.
Yeah.
And he had, so I don't know how much there was still inside the party, folks still kind of not buying in, kind of making life more difficult for him, etc. I think that they waited too long. I think, and you're seeing this in the Ontario NDP. In my view, I think they're waiting too long to elect a new leader. They shorten the runway. There's two things that happen when you do that. Number one is on the front end, it's virtually impossible to raise money. It's almost impossible to recruit volunteers. You don't have an identity. You don't have a connection. So that's the front end problem. Then the back end, when you do get elected, you don't have enough runway to pull all of the party together, everybody going in the same direction, etc. And I think that may have also contributed to the problem with the Liberals, and quite frankly, there was still a bit of a hangover from the win years that Ford was able to exploit.
For sure, I'm sure that there was. What if I was to say to you that neither the Liberals nor the NDP gave me any reason to think that they were thinking about the economy at all?
I think that would be fair. I think that I'm not sure it's true, but it certainly didn't come out as loudly and clearly in our campaign. And this is something that parties on the left, Liberals, the NDP, etc. This is something we're going to have to get our head around in terms of we could not get away with the campaign that the Conservatives won. We couldn't get away with it internally.
Right.
The one that the Conservatives ran in Ontario, every day, Doug Ford would get up in front of a bunch of guys, and 9 days out of 10 and 9 people out of 10, they were guys in their hard hats and talk about building 2 highways and whatever else it was, some jobs every single day. We can't do that. We have these internal demands that we have to articulate.
Stakeholders that have to be acknowledged.
Exactly. And, my own view is I'd rather get elected and get those things done than run on them in a campaign and lose.
Right.
And that's a challenge that we're going to have in terms of New Democrats and I would argue Liberals as well.
I understand it well.
Yeah, there's only room for two or three real issues in a campaign that you can sink in with people. You know that. Right. As soon as you get up, when you listen to a leader who has to do a 20-minute speech just to cover off half the platform, it's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And stuff that people out there don't even know why you're talking about.
Exactly.
Right. Monty McNaughton has put a knife into both the Liberals and the NDP because it is very difficult it certainly muddies the waters about who speaks for working people when the trade unions are campaigning for the Conservatives. Yeah, and that move with the unions, it felt to me, was very significant.
Well, it actually wasn't. a couple of things I'll say on this. Like, first of all, the unions that did campaign for Ford were not necessarily traditional NDP unions. A lot of construction unions, a lot of simple locals, etc. But there, I think there was
some of them used to be part of working families.
That is true. That is true.
And working families wasn't pro-NDP, but it was anti-conservative.
Exactly. So I think some of those folks have kind of shifted there, but this notion that the trade union movement has abandoned the NDP and gone to the Conservatives is not there. So that's one thing. But the other thing I will say is that, and this goes back to a comment that you just made about stakeholders and activists. I am told, you'll remember there was a meeting pulled together by Jerry Diaz and Smokey Thomas of a number of union leaders who met with Doug Ford. I wasn't there. I'm told by folks who were there that at one point in the meeting, Doug just simply said to them, I don't need you guys. I already have your members. And I think that is something that Doug Ford and the Conservatives understand. We are much, much more focused on the leadership and the activists in the labor movement.
Right.
All great people. All my good friends, many of them are my good friends, and all doing great work. But they themselves will tell you they're having more and more difficult time connecting with their members on the shop floor. So I think that there's this void,
and that's culture too. And that's culture too.
Absolutely. So there's this void or this gap between what's happening on the shop floor and what's happening in the political and activist leadership in some unions, not all, in some unions. And the Conservatives have done a very, very good job of just skipping by all of that at the top and getting right in, talking directly to, and again, I can't emphasize this enough, talking to those folks about the things that matter most to them. And that's been quite successful. And it's not new. It's been going on for a number of years. That shift has been happening for a number of years, and it's not unique to Canada.
Well, no, but I think, if you're a white guy who's worried about all the change in society that's stripping away the status that you think you should have, you're the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, but it's not just, that shop floor is not exclusively made up of white guys. In fact, it's a majority, in some cases, it's a majority of non-white guys that are down there.
I'm just talking about the kind of people that are feeling existentially threatened by the progress of women in our society and by the progress of minorities in our society and all of that is making other people feel like they're losing power. It feels to me like the Conservatives are speaking to those people that are losing power and status in society. And we're seeing Liberals and New Democrats as the people that are aiding and abetting that.
Yeah, and that is, without a doubt, one of the most shameful exploitations that's happening in politics today. I mean, that is, in my view, that is absolutely shameful, and it is not based on fact, it's not based on reality, and it's not based on building a better society for the future. And the fact that, this is the biggest danger with the Conservative leadership in Ottawa, is if he continues to try to exploit that, if he continues to try to build on that as his key to success, it's dangerous. It's dangerous and it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful.
Yeah. Okay. The time's really flown. I got a big question for you to end with, though. So there's a lot of talk in Canada about polarization. I chaired a panel at the Banff Forum a week or so ago about, is Canada becoming dangerously polarized? And what is the role of political parties in doing that? Brokerage politics seems to me to be disappearing. The Conservatives have no pretension to be a brokerage party anymore. The Liberals don't really seem to me to be one anymore. Ideology is becoming more important in those parties. On the other hand, the NDP have always wanted political polarization. It has been the dream of the NDP that the Liberal Party would disappear so that they could gather all the progressives under one banner and have a go at the Conservatives and elect a truly left-wing government in Canada. So, on balance, how do you feel about polarization?
You can have, it's not just a question of getting rid of the Liberal Party and having a socialist party on one end and a conservative party on the other end. I mean, we have in British Columbia, we have a two-party system. In Manitoba, we have a two-party system. And where the polarization is dangerous is in the polarization of ideas and in the polarization of exploitation and oppression. Whether it's happening in a two-party system like in the United States or in a three-party system like we have in Canada, that's the dangerous polarization. And that I am worried about. That I'm extremely worried about. And part of it is there's no common truth in politics anymore.
Right.
And, there was a time where...
No agreed upon set of facts.
Exactly. I mean, there was a time where you watched Knowlton Nash at night, you and millions of other Canadians, and you read your paper in the morning and you all agreed that's what happened today. No more. It's no more. And that is the other thing that dramatically feeds that polarization, is that there isn't a common set of, never mind a common set of beliefs. There's not even a common set of facts anymore. Right. And that makes it increasingly dangerous. So that is my bigger fear of polarization. I will freely admit on this show, I am one of those people who loudly cannot wait for the demise of the Liberal Party. But I'm not going to live to see it, unfortunately.
Despite your best efforts, and they've been very good efforts indeed. Michael, thank you for doing this show. What a fascinating conversation. You're a really interesting guy.
It's been great. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. And it's been great talking to you. It's been great battling with you in the back rooms and some of the panel shows that we've been on together. And I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
You were the first person, by the way, to tell me that things were going south in the green room before a panel we did, but just before the just before the 2018 election. I remember you saying to me, "We've got some new numbers, and you're going to hate them." So thanks for that day. I'll never forget that day. Anyway, thank you for doing this. Really interesting. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. Everybody who watched and listened to the show today, and come back next week. There'll be more Herle Burly. And thanks again, Michael. It's great talking.
Thank you.
Okay.